Alternative is a meaningless way to describe music, and I think we can do better. And I'm going to tell you why, right after I tell you about 6 awesome alternative bands you should check out immediately. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism, a love letter to music. Keep an eye on this channel and subscribe if you want to see explorations of other genres and music scenes. For early 2025, I've got a few goals. I plan to cover shoegaze, industrial, and do my first exploration of metal. Unless you count the video I did about Metallica's Load, but that's definitely not really metal. I'd say it's more alternative. Last time I went over the influence that Buzzcocks had on independent music labels, and the influence REM, Sonic Youth, The Replacements, and Husker Du had on the growing college rock scene. If you haven't seen that video yet and you want the whole story, click on the thumbnail, somewhere over here. Wipers started in 1977 in Portland, Oregon. They were led by Greg Sage, who I believe was the first person in either of these videos to release music. His dad was involved in the broadcasting industry, and when Sage was still a teenager, he was already fascinated by the music-making process. At the age of 17, which was 1971, he played guitar on the debut blues rock album for a professional wrestler named Beauregard. His guitar is already pretty compelling. Unfortunately, Beauregard's voice is not. He sounds kind of like a meatloaf who's never practiced before. The Wipers have often been referred to as punk, but they never thought of themselves as a punk band. In fact, Greg Sage thought of them more as an art project than a rock and roll band at all, and wasn't really interested in playing live. He just wanted to make albums. And originally the plan for Wipers was to make 15 albums over a 10-year period and then be done. They played fast and loud early on, but their playing was always a bit different from a lot of punk. For one, Sage was devoted to sludgy guitar tones and was pairing them with fast, compact songs. On their excellent album Is This Real? The album is angsty, catchy, varied, and shows that Wipers were interested in more than just making punk music. Which isn't to say that other punk bands weren't aspiring to more than rewriting blitzkrieg bop, but the musicianship made Is This Real an incredibly tight and powerful debut album. For me though, their second album, Youth of America from 1981, is the greatest achievement they've made. Going against trends in punk, they stretched out their songs to 4 minutes, 6 minutes, in one case a 10-minute song that never lets up the pace. Instead of getting dull though, it feels intense, and it builds over the runtime, with the drums a constant, steady kick and snare, providing just a light structure for the propulsive and always evolving guitar playing. Part of what makes this band not really fit punk is the focus on the musicianship and the fact that they don't shy away from focusing on the music over the verse-chorus-verse structure. Youth of America also feels like it laid out a template for grunge, with the reverb and sludgy guitars and often tight song structures, and the willingness to take some things from punk while not being confined to any of its supposed rules. I don't want to overstate their role, since other bands like Flipper, Black Flag, and Melvins would also have a big impact on grunge, and thus the way alternative music evolved, but Wipers were one of the large influences on grunge, and a major influence on Kurt Cobain in particular. So I did acknowledge in the first video that this is a bit US-centric of a video, but since then and now I've learned some interesting things. I'm mainly telling the story of how alternative took over in North America, but the UK beat us to it in a way. By 1986, indie music, actual music on independent labels, was flooding the charts over there. And our next band is the forerunner of Britain's big indie breakthrough. From Manchester, England, the Smiths are a band you've probably heard of, unless you're genuinely new to alternative music. Led by Stephen Morrissey and Johnny Marr, the Smiths started in 1982 in Manchester, England. Morrissey had a variety of links to punk. He'd been at the first Sex Pistols show and had formed a British fan club for the New York Dolls. Johnny Marr approached him about starting a band, in large part because he was impressed by Morrissey's taste and knowledge of music. And at a certain point, Stephen Morrissey began insisting people only refer to him as Morrissey, because he didn't like the name Stephen. And for the 80s, this wasn't actually that pretentious. There were people just insisting on being called Madonna, or Sting, or The Edge. Can you imagine if you had a friend who suddenly wanted you to call them The Edge, and they looked like this guy? Anyway, the creative direction of the Smiths was determined by Marr and Morrissey, with Marr's musicianship being a vital part of the sound. They avoided the synths that were popular at the time, and they were often considered jangle pop, although their version is much more melancholy and often humorous than the kind of jangle pop made by REM. In a way, you could consider the Smiths the climax of this story for a couple of reasons. They fit within the college rock paradigm, alongside bands from the previous video, but they're actually the first of these alternative bands to reach #1 on the charts while on an independent label. Again, this wasn't really the first time a band on an independent label got major recognition. You can point to bands who fit this description from other genres quite a bit earlier, looking at 60s protest folk, psychedelic rock, reggae, Louie Louie. But we're talking about the bands who were descended from the punk and post-punk rock lineage. The Smiths, during their brief existence, released 4 excellent albums, and a number of excellent singles as well. If you've not explored them at all yet, I'd recommend starting with the compilation Hatful of Hollow. This brings together many of their best singles, and unlike the compilation Louder Than Bombs, it doesn't sort of sputter out at the end either. It feels a bit more focused. But then I would recommend exploring all of their albums in order if you like what you hear there, because every one of them is very much worth your time. Their third album, The Queen Is Dead, is frequently listed as their very best, so if you want to go with the common consensus, that's considered the most essential one. For me, Meat Is Murder slightly edges out The Queen Is Dead, but it's narrow and neither of the other albums are far behind those two. So the Smiths managed to top the UK charts with their second album, Meat Is Murder, which then ushered in an era when independent music was all over the charts in the UK. So the invasion of independent artists happened way earlier in the UK. The wave was still building in the US. And another band that helped that wave gain force was Dinosaur Jr. This Massachusetts trio started in 1984 as Dinosaur, but had to change their name due to another earlier band with the same name, so they just added a junior. And the biggest grail I want from my own personal record collection is the first pressing of You're Living All Over Me that doesn't have the junior on there, it just says Dinosaur. The band was Jay Mascis on vocals and guitar, Lou Barlow on bass, and Murph on drums. My take on the importance of Dinosaur Jr. is that they made a new type of broadly accessible college rock, where guitar solos and virtuosity were cool again. They were influenced by punk, by post-punk and metal, but also by classic rock. And there was a psychedelicness to their sound. At the same time, Mascis's lazy-sounding vocal delivery is the first thing I think of when I hear the term slacker rock. And I definitely don't intend this as a dig to the band, but with Dinosaur Jr., college rock incorporated even more of the musical traits that were being shrugged off by punk in the first place. If you watch interviews with Jay Mascis, he doesn't seem to care whether people find him likable, or care what people think of him at all. In fact, despite the importance that's now given to his guitar work, he still thinks of himself more as a drummer, which was his first instrument, and seems indifferent when people say he's one of the greatest guitarists of the last 50 years. A great starting place with Dinosaur Jr. is their second album, You're Living All Over Me. This album is lo-fi, yet full of incredibly memorable riffs and catchy choruses. There are several songs on this one that are among my all-time favorites, like Sludge Feast and The Lung. And this is one of my top 10 favorite albums of all time. An album that confused me the first time I heard it at 13 or 14, but then quickly became an all-time favorite once I developed a taste for its dirtier sounding production than what I was used to. Dinosaur Jr. would follow it up with Bug, their third album. This one's almost as good as You're Living All Over Me, and I'd say these two are the best early Dinosaur Jr. albums. Green Mind, their fourth, is also a personal favorite, and despite it sounding a little bit better produced, a little bit less rough, I still think it has a lot of great moments. But then the remaining 90s albums see them moving further into a singer-songwriter direction with some similarities to Neil Young. I still like this phase, but I'm also sort of a completist with them. But Dinosaur Jr. has had a really impressive set of albums after reuniting in 2005. So far, my favorite of those has been their 9th album, Farm. If you enjoy their early albums, but you haven't looked into these later comeback albums, you definitely should. And the next band would be very close to the crest of that wave, about to hit the mainstream, and would see a lot of commercial success. That band was the Pixies. Pixies were from Boston, Massachusetts, and formed in 1986. Black Francis and Joey Santiago started the band. Then 2 weeks later, they put up ads for a bassist, looking for someone who liked both Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Husker Du. Kim Deal was the only one who showed up, and she didn't even have a bass or know how to play one. But she did, like a lot of the bands that Francis and Santiago were inspired by. So they brought her into the band anyway, and she ended up bringing in a drummer who she knew, David Levering. Pixies had a very strong pop sensibility, with Black Francis mentioning how Buddy Holly inspired his very compact song structures. But the real innovation for the Pixies was their embracing of a loud, quiet, loud approach to music that would be imitated to death by bands in the next decade. Their music was incredibly dynamic, and Francis referred to these as Dumbo dynamics, saying they only knew how to be quiet or loud, nothing in between. But this structure and its oscillation between these extremes made the hooks of the songs that much more energetic and even more of a focal point. If we compared to Husker Du, Bob Mould's songs were definitely poppy, but they were relentlessly loud throughout the whole song. The Pixies allowed their listeners to recover, which I think may have been the special sauce that made them catch on with a broader audience further outside of punk. They were very popular in Europe, and again, America was trailing along behind, not paying that much attention. From 1987 to 91, Pixies released an EP and 4 albums that I think all of them were excellent. But there were conflicts in the band, particularly between Frances and Deal. Deal was writing more of her own music, and early on wanted to write within Pixies as well. But Frances was very resistant to this, especially after a song Deal co-wrote and sang the lead vocals on became the band's first relatively big hit, called Gigantic. As time went on, Deal's role in the band was restricted more and more. She found a way to get her creative needs met, though, by founding the Breeders. Pixies ended unceremoniously in 1991 when Frances decided it was over, and he let Kim Deal know about it by fax. My biggest Pixies recommendations are their first 2 albums, Surfer Rosa and Doolittle. Surfer Rosa is produced by Steve Albini, an important part of alternative music history in itself. It shows off Pixies' immediate mastery of poppy yet edgy and aggressive songs. This one includes some songs that are well known now, like Where Is My Mind and Gigantic. It has some of my personal favorites too, like Break My Body and Cactus. I don't think it'll surprise anyone that I think Doolittle is the very best though. The songs on this album are so good from the beginning to the end of the album. They're poppy and dynamic and sinister. Some of them feel like punk surf rock, like Wave of Mutilation and Here Comes Your Man. Then Debaser and Gouge Away are some of their heaviest songs, without letting go of that amazing knack they had for memorable pop melodies. But you can't explore early 90s alternative and leave out Kim Deal's other band, The Breeders. Their debut, Pod, wasn't given nearly as much attention as it deserved when it came out, but it had a major impact on rock's development. This album showcases Kim Deal's songwriting, which is tonally dark, lo-fi, and surrealistic. She paints a subtler picture here than the Pixies did, with strange and stream of consciousness lyrics that I could see having been an influence on Nirvana's In Utero. It feels like you're witnessing something intimate but slightly out of focus, maybe something that wasn't supposed to be witnessed. The Breeders saw much more commercial success with their second album, Last Splash. This has the brilliant single, Cannonball, which helped the Breeders start getting the attention they deserve. This album feels more extroverted, with some songs that rock in a more direct way than on their first album, but it still preserves that atmosphere from the first album throughout much of the runtime. Pod is my very favorite, but both of these are albums I'd recommend to anyone who finds the Dumbo dynamics of the Pixies a bit too predictable. If you want to know why Black Francis was so grumpy towards Kim Deal towards the end of the band, here are a few fun facts. Steve Albini, who produced works by Pixies and the Breeders, was pretty dismissive of Pixies, yet he called Pod by the Breeders among his very best work. Kurt Cobain, despite liking the Pixies, told the press he thought Kim Deal should have written more of the songs, and he also said that Gigantic, the first Pixies song sung and mostly written by Deal, was his favorite Pixies song. So, Pixies had Black Francis and Kim Deal. The Breeders, for a time, had Kim Deal and Tanya Donnelly. And Tanya was in another ridiculously good band, Throwing Muses. I'm not going to go through all the bands related to these musicians, but here's a really useful subway map illustrating all of the related projects. My highest other recs from this are Belly, 50 Foot Wave, and Kristen Hirsch's solo work. But anyway, Throwing Muses. They formed in 1981 in Rhode Island by stepsisters Kristen Hirsch and Tanya Donnelly. Originally called Kristen Hirsch and the Muses, they released a demo tape in 1985, later known as the Doghouse cassette. This had a song on it that went to #1 on college radio called Sinkhole. Already at this early stage, you can hear the main elements that would make this band so unique and hard to define. Their songs show some inspiration from bands like R.E.M., a little touch of the folk jangle that was popular in the 80s and 90s, but they also experiment with musical and tonal shifts during songs to a degree that was uncommon in this kind of college rock. They also have the strange and surreal lyrics of Kristen Hirsch, who sings in a style that feels sometimes anxious, sometimes manic, and sometimes screaming or on the verge of a growl. Hirsch was hit by a car as a teenager and suffered a double concussion. Following this accident, she heard ambient sounds in her head, which would gradually become more like pieces of song. She would then piece together actual songs out of these pieces, and these were some of the earliest songs that she started writing. It's not helpful to just say they had a long run of great albums, but they did. I'd suggest starting with The Real Ramona, and it's for the same reason I recommend a lot of the albums in this series. This was sort of the dividing line. Earlier albums lean more experimental, have more frequent tempo changes, and a lot more musical complexity. It was maybe a little less accessible. This one still has some of that, but it's also very melodic and very fun, and has some of their strongest singles too, like Not Too Soon and Counting Backwards. But it also has some really dark and strange songs, like Hook in Her Head. If you want to go a bit more experimental than this, check out Hunkpapa, which came out right before The Real Ramona. This opens with Dizzy, which is a fun and smart, catchy hook to start off the album. But you get a wide range on here of what the Muses can do, including Dragon Head, which is another of my very favorites. It has two distinct halves, one half faster and heavier with some dissonance, and then a second half that's shimmering and melodic. Hirsch is the primary vocalist on the first half, and the second half is Tanya Donnelly, with each half showing off the strengths of each of those vocalists. Then if you want to go further into their experimental side, House Tornado is another one that's really good. From what we've covered so far, we're up to the cusp of the 90s, and into the 90s a little bit. And now something interesting is starting to happen. People are starting to actually use this term alternative. Mainly it's radio stations and record stores, people who need to categorize this stuff. It's a helpful catch-all for radio to bundle together everything that's new and getting hype and rock. All of the bands we've talked about, but also Jane's Addiction, who are doing psychedelic rock and roll. Red Hot Chili Peppers, who are doing funk rap. Fishbone, doing a soul funk rock metal hybrid. And Nine Inch Nails, making industrial rock. Basically, if it was rock that didn't fit on the station that was playing Motley Crue and Bon Jovi, it was alternative. From a radio perspective, I can see the use of this term. I mean, if you want to hear something that's not hard rock or classic rock, and you don't have a local college station, maybe you try out this alternative station. This made sense in the late 80s, and maybe even in the early 90s. But then the mainstream itself started changing.
But also people see rock and roll as youth culture, and when youth culture becomes monopolized by big business, what are the youth to do? Do you have any idea?
Hey, did you know that punk rock finally broke in '91?
R.E.M. hit the top of the album charts, then Nirvana, then Red Hot Chili Peppers, and then Pearl Jam, all within about a year. When alternative bands are consistently topping the charts, does the word alternative actually hold any meaning? And to go one step further, what about when bands start copying the sound of bands that are at the top of the charts? These new bands are getting signed immediately and going platinum 6 times, like for instance Candlebox. By what metric is Candlebox alternative? They were played constantly on MTV from their very first release. They had a chart-topping album and toured with Aerosmith. And none of this is an attack on Candlebox or any other specific band. I'm just making a point about the label alternative and how little it really means. So let's talk about one more specific example. Sponge from Detroit, Michigan. They formed in 1991, after Nevermind was already out. Their debut album, Rotting Pinata, had vocals similar to Eddie Vedder. Then the band continued on, occasionally trying out other types of rock, with some efforts that are more pop rock or more hard rock. Again, fine. And in 2024, 30 years after their debut album, they released an album called 1994. It was a covers album of what they considered alternative songs, all of which were released in 1994. These include songs by Blur, Oasis, Morrissey, Sonic Youth, Mazzy Star, and Alice in Chains. The album 1994 feels surprisingly coherent since the band's adjusting all of these songs to fit with a sort of post-grunge sound, but it still feels like a weird set of songs to consider part of one musical scene. Many of these were huge hits from the year they came out, in multiple countries. So according to common usage, and according to Sponge, alternative isn't actually about whether it's part of the mainstream, which means it must be about the music, right? Let me answer my own question with a question. Does R.E.M. sound like the same music genre as Soundgarden? Soundgarden takes obvious inspirations from Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and they were also inspired by the underground like the Stooges and Butthole Surfers. But none of that has anything to do with what R.E.M. was doing at any point in their very diverse career. And you could use a ton of other alternative bands to prove this point. So if it's not about the music itself, and it's not about being an alternative to the mainstream, what does it mean? It just means certain radio stations decided to play it. Not college rock stations, but commercial stations that are trying to make money. So by the late 90s, alternative included nu metal, like Limp Bizkit, Britpop, like Oasis, and Buck Cherry, who were like 90% classic rock. Know what these stations didn't play? Bands like Pavement, Unwound, Chibo Motto, Sleater Kinney, Built to Spill, Fugazi, Guided by Voices, because promoting new rock bands that were actually doing something new was not what alternative radio was about, unless it was what the major labels were pushing at the time, like nu metal. Looking at the bands who are considered alternative in 2025 via the Grammy Award nominations, we have everything from singer-songwriters like Phoebe Bridgers to synth pop, and bands who are very traditional blues rock. Bon Iver gets to be both alternative and mainstream for whatever reason. Somehow Taylor Swift is not alternative, but Lana Del Rey is. Alternative has no clear identity or a clear audience. So the PSA part of this video comes down to this. There's always a better way to describe the sound of a band than saying they're alternative. If you tell someone you like alternative music, they could think Sonic Youth, or they could think Avril Lavigne, or they could think Nickelback. Unless you do listen to all three of these bands, and if you do, touché. In any case, music terminology is admittedly not the most important issue out there, so whether I've convinced you about the term alternative or not, hopefully I've gotten you curious about exploring some new bands, or revisiting something you haven't heard in a while. Thanks for watching Eclecticism, and I'll see you next time.